This is a presentation on Betty Hart by Emily Herter. Betty Hart was a researcher out at the University of Kansas who studied language development in young children. She is most famous for her research with co-author Todd Risley, studying how socioeconomic status impacts the language experiences of children. Her work had an enormous influence on the development of early intervention and parenting programs, and the impact is still seen in the field of early childhood education today. In 1968, Hart began researching language interventions at Turner House Preschool, a preschool in inner-city Kansas that served mainly low-income African-American preschool-age children. For more than a decade, Hart and her research partner Todd Risley developed and tested the efficacy of intervention models designed to increase the length and complexity of sentences used by children at the preschool. Together, Hart and Risley developed a teaching method called incidental teaching that is still used in ABA today. Incidental teaching is learning that occurs within the child's natural play. It is child-initiated and naturally reinforcing. In incidental teaching, teachers use children's natural requests for objects during play to teach verbal behavior. During playtime, teachers reinforce children's verbal requests for materials by giving them the desired item. In order to increase the length of a child's utterances, they gradually increase the complexity of the response required to gain the item. For instance, at first, a teacher might give a child a block when requested. Over time, the teacher might prompt the child to request a red block, only providing the requested item after the child produces a descriptive adjective. Hart and Risley found that incidental teaching was effective at increasing children's use of adjective-noun combinations, both when making requests and in spontaneous speech during play. They compared language samples of children in intervention groups with language samples of children from higher income households. They found that the speech patterns in the intervention group more closely resembled speech patterns from the higher income group after intervention. They concluded that incidental teaching effectively teaches complex verbal behavior and has a meaningful impact on children's language outcomes. Hart's work at the Turner School inspired her most famous research into the early language experiences of young children. Hart found that the vocabulary of children at the Turner School remained significantly limited compared to 4-year-olds from high and middle socioeconomic backgrounds. This led her to explore the language development of children before they enter preschool. Hart and Risley undertook a 2.5-year longitudinal study in which the researchers recorded monthly, hour-long samples of interactions between parents and their children from ages 10 months to 3 years. The families sampled came from diverse socioeconomic backgrounds. From this research, Hart and Risley published numerous articles and 2 books, their most famous being Meaningful Differences in the Everyday Experience of Young American Children. Data from this study allowed Hart to dive deeply into the environmental factors that impact language development. Hart and Risley found that the early language experiences of young children directly coincided with children's language outcomes. A number of factors were linked to higher language gains for children, including relative positivity of parent-child interactions, or the proportion of encouraging comments compared with corrections. They also found children whose parents consistently monitored and used strategies to capture their child's attention had higher language skills at age 3. Finally, and most importantly, the quantity of distinct vocabulary words used in conversations with children mirrored the vocabulary used by children at age 3. All of these factors correlated with the children's language outcomes at age 3 and their overall cognitive abilities as measured on IQ tests. The most famous finding from Hart and Risley's research was the 30 million word gap by age 3. Hart and Risley determined that by the age of 3, a child from professional families would have been exposed to 43 million words on average, compared to 24 million heard by working-class families and 11 million heard by low-income children. This gap in exposure accounts for differences in children's vocabulary. While these numbers have been debated more recently by other researchers, this study was hugely impactful, and these findings are still commonly used to justify early intervention and parenting programs. After reviewing Hart's research, I was left with the question of what is next. While there is evidence that shows that a gap in language exposure already exists when a child enters preschool, what does this mean for children who are already 3 or 4? What can be done to make up the difference? I am also curious about what interventions Hart would recommend that teachers and therapists use in working with children as they are developing language and in the classroom as they grow older. Hart's research had a lasting impact on the field of education. The intervention model of incidental teaching, the intentional expansion of language within children's everyday requests for play materials, is still used in classrooms and in ABA therapy. It is especially important to education because it is an intervention that can be implemented in classrooms without requiring extensive teacher training or expensive curriculum materials. Results from Hart and Risley's longitudinal study impacted how language development is understood, since it showed that language ability is directly shaped by early language experiences. This has many implications for educational policy and inspired early intervention programs across the country that are designed to identify children at risk of language delays before they start school and provide therapy in a home setting. It also inspired parenting programs to help equip low-income or at-risk parents with support in order to improve the quality of verbal interactions with their children. This concludes my presentation on Betty Hart. Thank you for listening.